So my husband, Steve, was an accountant and he worked for my practice. It was awesome. He stayed home to take care of our kids and he was able to work from home. That's like widespread now, but then it was very unusual. And he loved taking care of our kids. And he was an awesome accountant. He was into kayaking. He read novels. He always had to have the newest, fastest computer, that kind of thing. And he did the accounting for my practice. And then he started having problems remembering if he'd been to the post office or not, and had been to the bank, and he handled all of that, for the practice, and then he would forget appointments. I would call him 30 minutes ahead of time, and he would still forget to take our kids like to an eye appointment or something like that, and it got really worrisome. And he was only 51 at that point. And then it progressed to shuffling around while he's trying to do his quarterly tax return, which should have taken 20 minutes on his computer to do. And so we took him to a neuropsychiatrist. And at the time, dementia was mentioned, but the doctor thought more likely that it was depression that was causing his memory problems. He was depressed. Our youngest daughter was 13, and she was a little bit of an angry teen, and they weren't getting along all that well. And so we thought it was that, and he was put on medication, but he just continued to get worse. We moved about an hour north so I could start another newborn intensive care unit. And he could not figure out how to get around. And he'd always been one of those guys that could like follow his nose, so not long after we moved up there, it was obvious there were really serious memory problems. And so a neurologist had a full workup, and it turned out that he had Alzheimer's disease, early onset Alzheimer's. I didn't even know as a doctor that existed, that people as young as him could have Alzheimer's already. And, that was a huge blow. You can imagine, all of our grandparents had all lived to their 90s, and we thought we were going to live to a ripe old age, and that just wasn't going to happen anymore. So he was put on the usual Alzheimer's meds, and, by 2006, he had to stop driving. He was 56.
So within 5 years, he couldn't.
Within 5 years.
Drive.
And he went to the point where he could create the most intricate, perfect forms for like my medical practice, to not even being able to remember how to turn on the computer or use a mouse or use his calculator, add 1 + 1 = 2. I mean, that's how bad it was over that period of time. So, so now we get into 2008. He's going down the tubes really fast. He can hardly finish a sentence. He shuffles when he walks. He can't pick up his feet and run. He has tremors. He really has a lot of difficulty in the morning, very sluggish, can't remember how to use the water dispenser from the refrigerator, that kind of thing. I mean, it was really getting bad. And along came these 2 clinical trials we hadn't had any for a while in our area, and there were 2. And I scheduled him for 2 days in a row for screenings. And the night before, I'm reading about these 2 different drugs, because you can only be in 1 clinical trial. And I'm trying to find out the risks and benefits of the drugs. And I happened on this press release about a medical food that was going to come out in 2009, like about a year later. And it said that in their pilot study, 1 dose, the people with Alzheimer's, nearly half of them had improvement in their memory. And I thought, okay, what is this? And I was able to find their patent application, because they didn't really say what it was or what it did. And I found their patent application, and I learned about the concept of Alzheimer's as a type of diabetes of the brain, and that there's a problem with getting glucose into brain cells, and that this fuel called ketones can actually get into the brain and can fill in. It's an alternative fuel to glucose, and these cells could use glucose, and this could possibly help somebody with Alzheimer's. And the way they were doing this was with MCT oil, it's called, medium chain triglyceride oil. And I just happened to know what that was because I'm a neonatologist, a newborn specialist. Yeah. So we were adding that to the feedings of our tiny preemies back in the 80s. And then the formula manufacturers started adding it to their formulas directly. And it's in a lot of infant formulas today. And then I learned that it's extracted from coconut oil. So these are fatty acids that are in coconut oil. And I didn't know I could get MCT oil. I thought maybe it was a medical thing you could only get in hospitals or whatever, but I knew I had seen coconut oil in health food stores, So I'm learning this at about 1 a.m. and we had to be to the screening at 9 a.m. So I didn't have time to do anything about it. So he goes for the screening, and he did terrible. He needed to get a score of at least 16 points on this mini mental status test. That's a 30-point test. It's an easy test. We would pass it, with that flying colors. He missed so many of them, and he ended up with a score of 14 out of 30. He needed 16 points, and he didn't qualify for the study. And we were devastated because, this is our only hope, that some Alzheimer medication would come along that actually worked. He was on the others. They didn't really do anything for him. And then the doctor asked him to draw a clock. And let's see if you can see this, if it comes through or not. Can you see that?
Yeah. That was him trying to draw a clock.
Yeah. Does that look like a clock? No. It's a bunch of little random circles, a few numbers, and it's very disorganized. And she told me, she said he's on the verge of severe Alzheimer's. And so that was very depressing news. And I had just read about, coconut oil has these medium chain triglycerides. So on the way home, we went to a health food store, picked up coconut oil. And then when we got home, I kind of went back to my freshman biochemistry. I looked it up online. What are medium chain triglycerides? I found the composition of coconut oil, fatty acid composition. I figured out if I give him a little over 2 tablespoons of coconut oil, that should equal the dose of the medical food that they had used. Right. So the next day, I gave him coconut oil, and it's kind of solid, semi-solid at room temperature. Mix it into oatmeal for breakfast. And about 3 hours later, was his screening for the second trial. And this time we're in a different city and a different building, obviously, different company. And he gains 4 points and qualified for the study. Same test, same exact test, but the things he gained on had changed. It was a different day of the week. He got the day of the week. He got the season, which he didn't get the day before. He knew what town we were in, which was different, and what floor of the building he was on, which was different than the day before. But then he remembered them at just the right moment. And it just happens that's about when the ketones from coconut oil peak, is about 3 hours after you take coconut oil. Right. So I thought, okay, well, were we just lucky? Was it prayers? Was it, what was it? Was it really the coconut oil? And I thought, okay, we're going to at least keep this going. But he told me that day, he said, it's like the light switch came on in his head. That's how he felt. He felt different right away. Wow. So the next day and every day after, I started giving him a little over 2 tablespoons for breakfast. And then I started cooking with it. I thought, the ketones from like the MCT oil only last about 3 hours. And I said, well, what does your brain do the other 21 hours? Your brain constantly needs fuel. Even when you're sleeping, your brain needs a lot of fuel. Right. So I thought, why not just give it to and throughout the day? So I got every cookbook known to man on coconut oil and recipes, and just started cooking with it. And over the next few days, it was really remarkable how much he improved. He started coming out of the bedroom in the morning. Instead of being sluggish, he'd kind of come bouncing down the hall. He was whistling again. He was telling jokes again, finishing sentences, smiling, laughing. He said his mood had improved, and he could get that utensil out of the drawer. He could get his water out of the fridge. It was just like, and about the 4th or 5th day, we're like, our lives have changed. Something has happened here, clearly. And, so I became completely obsessed with ketones and this idea of helping people with Alzheimer's. And, when I knew, and this is something on the shelf that people could do right away. Yeah. Jim Abrams. I know him. I actually know him. And he's in my book, the story of the ketogenic diet, what happened with him. And, you probably know that, they're studying ketogenic diet for cancer. And, and this very aggressive brain tumor, glioblastoma, is kind of where they started with it. Yeah. It seems to be very effective at shrinking those tumors and slowing it down, controlling it. And so, they're using very strict ketogenic diet for cancer. And there's something like at least 36 studies going on now worldwide, clinical trials of ketogenic diet for controlling various cancers. And coconut oil and MCT oil, like the Charlie Foundation, their dietitians, they recommend people include that in the diet because they are ketogenic. And there are many other benefits of coconut oil too. It has anti-inflammatory substances. It lauric acid in it is antimicrobial. It kills all kinds of bacteria, viruses, including coronavirus. There's studies in the Philippines showing that. And it kills just the dental bacteria that you see that in the news sometimes, that
Yeah.
they predispose you to Alzheimer's if you have poor, like dental decay. And you can swish it in your mouth, and you can
The oil pulling.
gingivitis and plaque and everything in your mouth by doing that with coconut oil. But so lauric acid. And then another cool thing about lauric acid is there's a study from Japan showing that it stimulates ketone production directly in astrocytes, which are the brain cells that nourish the neurons. They can shunt ketones directly to neurons, and that they've done this in the dish, and they just need to prove, that this does happen in living creatures. So that's remains to be seen. But I strongly suspect that's why Steve improved so much with coconut oil, which has relatively lower, ketones compared to MCT oil. So, there's just a lot of good things about and it's virgin coconut oil that has all these things. If you get refined coconut oil, you'll lose a lot of that. Well, I kind of encourage people to do both, because if you take coconut oil and an MCT oil, but coconut oil tends to sustain the ketones longer. I actually started mixing. I used whole coconut oil, but then I started mixing coconut and MCT oil. Dr. Richard Veach at the NIH, who was a ketone expert, was saying, just forget the coconut oil, just give them MCT oil. You need to get higher ketone levels. And I thought, okay, if I mix them, I can have steady higher ketone levels.
Right.
So I started actually mixing them. I was not going to give up coconut oil because that's what he improved with. And I thought, if I stop that and he gets worse, I'm going to shoot myself,
Yeah.
So I kept both going. And then I met Dominic. We met Dominic probably in about less than a year after that happened. We happened to go to a research update at USF, and he recognized us from a newspaper article that had been in our regional newspaper about it. And he was working on ketogenic diet for Navy SEALs. They can have seizures when they dive for 10 or 15 minutes with 100% oxygen. And he read this, and they had interviewed Dr. Veach, and he talked about the ketone ester. And, Dominic introduced himself. We got to be really good friends. We still are. He just wrote the foreword for my new book. I think there's value to both. I do both myself. I'm worried about Alzheimer's because I have it on both sides of my family, very strong on my mother's side. Her mother, her sister, 3 of my cousins now, my older cousins, all have Alzheimer's, all have had it. And so I'm really worried about it, but I seem to be doing fine. But like the day Steve started doing this, I started taking it too. I started taking coconut oil. When we added MCT oil, I added that. And I also do take ketone salts, ketone esters. Probably over the course of that first year, especially when I met Dominic, that's when I learned about the Charlie Foundation from him.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started paying. We were already doing a Mediterranean diet, so it was already lower carb. Low glycemic index, that kind of thing. Adding the fat made it more ketogenic. And Steve was just kind of naturally getting rid of, eating too much fruit. And he would leave the bread, he'd leave the rice. And I finally just started taking it off his plate, not even putting it on, because he wasn't really even eating it. He didn't seem to need it. And so he was effectively on a ketogenic diet. We just didn't have the home meter to be able to check it at that point, in 2008, 2009. So we really transitioned to that. It was very beneficial for me too. I was getting a little now, what was the name of that medication? Things like that. And it, that kind of went away. And I felt like I increased I call it mental endurance, because I was obsessed with getting this message out, and I was writing to people constantly, reading emails constantly. And I couldn't really believe how many hours a day I could do things like that, but I really kind of attributed it to the coconut and oil, that was happening. Anyway, so if you take, include coconut and MCT oil, at least coconut oil. I mean, some people do great with just coconut oil. People with Parkinson's, sometimes some of them have said, I do better with coconut oil. Nothing happens when I take MCT oil, so there's something about the coconut oil, a lot of things probably that are different. But it can help sustain the ketone level. So even like you have birthday cake,
Right.
you still have a ketone level because these oils now, they turn to ketones no matter what you eat. It's just even more effective, and you get a higher ketone level if you combine it with a low carb diet. So, that's the beauty of it. And then the supplements can help boost your ketone levels temporarily for several hours. And Steve did, I don't know if we got to talk about this the last time, but Steve was a pilot study of one person with the ketone ester, with Dr. Veach's ketone ester. And this was in 2010. So I wasn't allowed to talk about it. It was confidential. Yeah. Dominic knew we were doing it, but there weren't too many other people that did. And so Steve became a pilot study of one person with the ketone ester. And Dr. Veach was really hoping I would stop giving him coconut and MCT oil, but I said, no way, I'm not going to stop. Yeah. But he was at a point where he actually got into that clinical trial. And it turned out, we learned later, he was on the placebo for the first 18 months. Oh, wow. And then it was a crossover. It was so we knew that wasn't for that drug, that helped him, because he was on the placebo. And the only thing that was different was what we were doing with the diet, the coconut oil, MCT oil. And so then he did switch over to the drug, and his hair started growing out white. He had like a white ribbon, coming out, and he started having weird symptoms. He fainted. He had abrasions that wouldn't heal. Like he had one on his shin that wouldn't heal for a month. It was ridiculous. He'd nick himself shaving. It would bleed for 3 or 4 days.
Wow. What was the drug called, Mary?
It was called semaglutide, and it was supposed to remove beta amyloid plaques from the brain, which is one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's. It was supposed to remove the plaques. And, he was on it for maybe 6 weeks, and he had all these side effects. He got a bad cold. He broke out in fever blisters, which he hadn't had for, quite a while. And they were constant before we started the coconut oil. That's the other thing. Coconut oil, kills herpes simplex virus, which causes these fever blisters. And I thought, oh my God, what's going on? But so then I withdrew him from the study, and Dr. Veach decided at that point, let's see if we can get him back, reverse some of these kind of new Alzheimer's symptoms we were seeing with the ketone ester. And he said, we'll do it as a pilot study. He was NIH, so we did it. He sent it to me. This raw material, which tasted like jet fuel, showed up on my doorstep. Yeah. It was just horrible tasting. And I had to figure out how to make it something that Steve could drink, so it was a challenge. Tried so many different flavors and everything. And he took it, he knew what it was. He knew he had Alzheimer's. He knew what he used to be able to do. And he took it willingly, but he shuddered every time he took it. He was like, made in Dr. Veach's lab. So it was drop by drop made in his lab by his chemist, Todd King. And they would send me a supply of it. It would just show up, the raw material. And they said to dilute it, about 3 parts water to 1 part ester, try to add something sweet, oh God, it was a real challenge. Yeah. But even, then what I hated was that the only thing I could get it sweet with was something, it was called soda stream concentrate, which had a lot of sugar. And I hated doing that, but 2 things made me feel like, okay, maybe this is all right. Number one, I talked to Dr. Stephen Cunnane in Canada. I don't know. And he said, I talked to him about it, and he said, well, he said, most of the brain in Alzheimer's can still use glucose. It's just certain areas of the brain that can't. And, so giving them glucose is probably not going to be harmful. And then the other thing was that we were checking his ketone levels, and I would always check his blood sugar level because I was worried about it. Even if he ate, even when he took this with the concentrate in it, his blood sugar went down every time. And usually your blood sugar goes up after you eat, at least a little bit. His blood sugar would go down and significantly, and his fasting blood sugar went down, down, down. Even his cholesterol came down over time. I'm not even worried about cholesterol. I don't think it's a big issue that they say it is, but it did come down. People always ask me that. Didn't his cholesterol go off the charts? No, it came down. Yeah. It actually came down to normal, under 200, in spite of eating 8 or 10 tablespoons of coconut oil every day, So, yeah, anyway. Yeah. Well, the combination, coconut and MCT oil. Eight
Well,
to 10. We worked up slowly. It took months to get up to the tolerate C8, with that one, there's a type of MCT oil. It's called C8, there are a couple brands out there. And that's what the medical food was. He would have that. He was in the bathroom like 15 minutes later.
yeah.
For some reason, he just could not tolerate that particular version of MCT oil. But there's one that's C8 and C10, and he did fine with that, and always did fine with coconut oil,
Yeah.
So, but you do have to kind of work up very slowly, and it did take us months to get up to that much. But then we were cutting out, the substituting it for other fats and carbs, getting rid of a whole lot of carbohydrate. And he maintained a really healthy weight. He was 5'7", he was 165. He was a muscular guy.
Yeah.
He had, was doing kayaking. He'd been a wrestler in high school, and and he maintained his weight, thereafter, and blood sugar was excellent. He was pre-diabetic before we started the coconut oil, and coconut oil has no cholesterol in it.
There's no
That's an old myth. And so you can imagine what it was like for me trying to talk to doctors about coconut oil. I learned it was an artery clogging fat. I believed that up to that moment in time. I believed that, and I wondered why it would be in a health food store. And then I found out that, basically, the hydrogenated oil industry, so we're talking margarines, shortenings, the people that were producing those things, coconut oil was a big competitor for them, because if you think of what Crisco looks like, what coconut oil looks like, they're trying to get higher shelf life by doing this to the fats. Coconut oil has a 2-year shelf life at room temperature, so that they were their big competitor, and they just tried their darndest to get. They started calling saturated fat the artery clogging fat, and then coconut oil became the artery clogging fat, and it was basically politics and industry that and not science, right, that drove that. The tropical oils, and they're so different; they couldn't be more different.
Yeah.
So I've spent a whole lot of time actually reading everything about coconut oil, and like most people don't know that most plant oils, soybean, olive, all of these, sunflower, safflower, they all have some saturated fat in them.
Yeah.
And it's long chain saturated fats, and it's the same saturated fats that are in animal fats. It's just less in the plant oils. Coconut oil it's very high in saturated fat, but only 11% of the fat in coconut oil are these, and it's in the same range as the plant oils of these saturated fats that are in animal fat. Most of the saturated fat in coconut oil are these medium chain triglycerides that aren't at all in these other plant oils, and minuscule amounts in animal fat, so it's completely different fatty acid composition. And, these saturated fats behave completely differently, like in the MCT oil, for example, it doesn't become solid until way below the freezing point. And people think of of saturated fat as solid fat. I mean, that's what they always said. It's going to clog your arteries because it's solid fat. Right. Well, MCT oil doesn't even turn solid until, it's like -5 degrees or something like that. Yeah. Coconut oil becomes solid at 76 degrees. So that's 20 degrees below body level. So the minute you put it in your mouth, it melts, and it's not a solid fat that's just going to clog up all of your arteries. It just doesn't happen. And, that's just a big myth. It's been perpetuated by, the American Heart Association, for one, and, and then, the dietary guidelines for Americans, USDA, they rely on organizations like the American Heart Association to help dictate our dietary guidelines. And the studies that they rely on, the American Heart Association, were from the 1950s. And they still consider these their core studies to make these recommendations about eating fat, not eating saturated fat, and this type of thing. But the crazy thing is, those studies, they were in populations in the US and Europe. Number one, no coconut oil. People were not eating coconut oil in those populations, so they can't blame it on coconut oil.
Right.
And secondly, these populations were eating a lot of trans fat. There was a lot of margarine, a lot of Crisco, these hydrogenated oils, trans fats, that people were eating, and anywhere from 15 to 50% of their fat were these trans fats. but that wasn't documented at all. It wasn't considered at all. They weren't even thinking about trans fats being harmful at that point. So they weren't distinguishing them,
Right.
so to speak, so, these studies, they claimed, oh, they raise your cholesterol, saturated fat, raise your cholesterol, but, but these people who had high cholesterol were eating these trans fats, most likely, or many of the people in their studies. So, they weren't really valid, and they need to toss those out, and they need to look at the much newer studies that are showing that saturated fat is not a problem. Some really big studies since then, recent studies, I mean, massive studies have shown that eating fat and saturated fat do not increase your risk of heart disease. The reason you need a plaque at all is there's inflammation and damage in the blood vessel wall,
Right.
and it needs to be patched or it's going to weaken and rupture, So, the cholesterol is part of this patch that forms to repair damage to an artery wall. And, like people with high blood pressure tend to have inflammation in the blood vessels. High blood pressure is really the leading cause of premature death, effects of high blood pressure but inflammation in the artery walls are part of that. The constant kind of pounding the high pressure against the artery walls damages it. And I started thinking about this lately. Okay, so I'm reading about how this patch forms and everything, and cholesterol is just a part of it, and I thought, what if that plaque didn't form? Then what would happen? It would weaken, and that's aneurysms. You hear of aneurysms rupturing, blood vessels can rupture, and that would be the alternative. So, what really needs to be done is controlling blood pressure and reducing inflammation.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
they're not looking at that.
Diet, and they don't. How much do they talk about diet? They say get rid of your fat. They have their guidelines are wrong. I just totally believe that their guidelines are wrong on that.